The Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship Program represents a rewarding academic professional development opportunity for faculty at Montgomery College. The fellowships are a product of a unique collaboration between Montgomery College and the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. It's the first of its kind between the Smithsonian Institution and a community college.
Salvatore DiMaria grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and lived in New Mexico, Alaska, and Georgia. His BS in biology and MA in geography are from the University of New Mexico. He was a VISTA volunteer and had careers in state government and private industry as a chemist, environmental trainer, and researcher. He began teaching geography at Montgomery College in the fall of 2000. Since then, he has developed courses in geographic information systems and political geography. He has traveled to Europe and Africa, enjoys reading about history, travel, and nature, and is nurturing an interest in the world's wildcats.
The reason I selected the title Worlds in Collision, the European Appropriation of the Americas, was simply because I had done so much reading about the Columbian exchange, essentially from the Native American point of view, that in a sense, yes, what happened was Europe basically appropriated the Americas from the people that lived in this particular part of the world. But the original proposal, the reason I got so interested in this was the fact that the proposal was from the old worlds to the new, how exploration and trade shaped modern America. And it really dovetailed extremely well with what I had been doing already in this class called Global Geography, which we teach here. And that is that I had been talking about a topic of how in the world we got to the situation that we have. I do a lecture called Setting the Stage, in which I pose the question, why is it that so much of the world speaks French and English and Spanish, European languages? Why is it that Europe dominates so much? And I talk about that. I'd done this for years with my students. And I also had done a talk and still do this with talking about foods of the Americas. That one is always a very popular one because I bring in samples of foods of the Americas to my class and talk about the importance of corn and potatoes and, of course, chocolate to the rest of the world. So since I had been looking at this and working with this, when this topic came up, it dovetailed just beautifully with what I had already been doing. And so I got very excited about it and joined this. And what I did then was to integrate the material that we had been studying, called, the Columbian exchange material, into the lessons for Geography 130, the Global Geography. And I integrated it into the class lessons with my students. I now talk about the Columbian exchange and the impact that the European contact with the Americas had, both on the Americas and back on the old world, because it really did change the entire world. And the new material now covers, with all the vast readings that we've done and the discussions that we've done and the museum visits that we've done, I am cognizant a lot more now about disease impacts from livestock and plants that have come in, and all of that. So if we look at that, that was my original proposal, to integrate it into my class and covering the disease impacts and putting it into the lecture of Foods of the Americas, as I say, usually accompanied by samples. Go ahead and change it. What I did then was integrated the new material into an assignment for my class. And since there's a great deal of emphasis put on writing skills in Montgomery College, I thought, well, a term paper would be quite appropriate for this. And so what I did is I assigned a term paper to the students based on museum visits and research. And we visited several museums during the course of the fellowship, and I selected two of them, the National Museum of the American Indian, one of my favorite one downtown, and the Museum of American History as well. And what I did is I offered 6 term paper topics, 3 concerning each museum. Okay, so from the American Indian Museum, which I found out quite a number of students had already visited and were quite familiar with. So I thought that was really a great start. Okay, if you take a look at that, I looked at a number of themes, 3 themes really. First contact themes. And this is addressed at the museum right on the first floor. There is a kiosk that has a display of first contacts, an interactive display. So I had students, if they were going to do this theme, to research 3 first contacts based on interactive screens and answer some of these questions. Where and when did the first contact occur? Who were the Europeans? Who were the native groups? What were the immediate effects of the first contact? Everybody knows that there were disease impacts, for instance, but there were other effects as well. What happened to the native group subsequently? And what, if any, trade was initiated? We did some summer reading during the fellowship, and one of my topics that I looked at was actual trade dealing with fur. Fur trade became extremely important to the United States, and the demand for beaver skins, for instance, back in Europe really drove a lot of the exploration of the United States. So a lot of trade was initiated. A lot of the Native Americans became very much integrated into the trade that was going back into Europe. And then finally, where does the native group now live? If they're still extant, where are they living now? What is their condition? Second theme was the effect of the European diseases in livestock, specifically those diseases that hit them. What diseases were transferred to North America by Europeans? What long-term changes occurred to the groups? Once you destroy 80-90% of a particular society, you change that society forever, really. What animals were brought to North America? This changed North America greatly, environmentally. It had major impacts on Native American people, and of course, some of them adopted the imported animals, including, of course, the horse, and Native Americans became some of the greatest horsemen in the world in a very short period of time. Other things that students could look at were effects that European livestock had on the natives, specifically the adoption of the horse and the adoption of other livestock changing native cultures. So here, the Navajos become sheep herders. They'd never had sheep before, but they adopted them, and they've become major sheep herders in the Southwest. And then the third theme was acculturation by both Europeans and native peoples, because both changed. Many goods were traded between natives and Europeans. So which ones? How did the adoption of European goods change the cultures? And it did. They became dependent on European goods, in fact. The adoption of native foods changed European society, of course, with the movement of corn and potatoes back to Europe and other parts of the world as well. Adaptations that native tribes were forced to make during the U.S. expansion, native ceremonies that are still held to be important, and the concept of survivance, which is addressed in the Museum of the American Indian, the concept of survival and adoption of different cultures to be able to, cultural aspects to survive, and how has that affected modern tribes. From the American History Museum, I selected 3 different topics as well. And the first one, the area of the American History Museum that we concentrated on was a display called On the Water. It's a great display in a little corner of the museum itself, and one of the things that they display there and have a lot of information on was the Atlantic slave trade. So one of the questions I posed was the key places in Africa where slaves were held and shipped out to the Americas. Here's another continent that has been tremendously affected by this Columbian exchange. What was traded to Africans in exchange for slaves, conditions on slave ships, subsistence crops that were grown. The role of rum and molasses became very, very important in this trade. The diseases that Africans introduced into the Americas. It was bad enough that Europeans introduced things like smallpox and measles, but then the Africans come over, and many of them are carrying malaria. And so what you've got is a double hit to Native American groups. And we're talking about North, Central, and South America here as well. And then contacts that Africans had with Native Americans. And in fact, you find quite a number of Native Americans who have both Native American and African ancestry, as well as European ancestry as well. A second theme was, of course, the importance of sugar and tobacco trade. Certainly to Maryland and Virginia, tobacco became extremely important. So I posed a number of questions that students could look at: how plantations were operated, where did tobacco varieties originate. The tobacco that's grown here that became the real popular tobacco actually isn't the Virginia tobacco, it's the one from South America. That's the stronger tobacco. That's what they grew around here. How tobacco was consumed, who were indentured servants, and they played a major role in plantations. And then, of course, questions dealing with sugarcane: how was it grown, how was it harvested, and how was sugar used in Europe. And then finally, the last theme was Atlantic crossings, the actual crossings and how they changed from Europe to the Americas. After the U.S. was established, what nationalities come to the U.S., how were passenger ships operated from early on, and then after the War of 1812. And then you started getting things like packet ships. You started finally getting regular shipping and regular trips back to the across the Atlantic, rather. And then that changed the nature of movement, migration between Europe and the Americas. Atlantic crossings improved tremendously after 1870, and then finally we got luxury lines changing travel after the 1920s here. So, okay, I went ahead and posed these questions and integrated them with the setting the stage slides. And what I did is I started out talking about how Europeans looked at the world to begin with, looking at a map having only Asia, Europe, and Africa, introduced the idea that we talk about orienting ourselves because maps were drawn with east to the north. And the center of the map is the center of the world. It's Jerusalem right there. Have a map like this, and there's absolutely no room for new continents. There's no concept of other continents other than Europe, Africa, and Asia. So a modern map I discuss with students. We're used to looking at a map like this, of course. Why do we put north to the top? Because it's really hard to draw a map with the Americas down at the bottom of the map. And so since all the travels started being east to west, we started switching the orientation of the map with north to the top. Then I also introduced the idea of the Silk Road. A lot of this talk is basically the idea of Europe changing its entire outlook, its entire way of looking at itself. Originally, many Europeans looked at themselves as being trapped in the northwestern part of this old continent, and they could not get past the Middle East area because it was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, they're interested in getting to China and other places in the East to get to the silk, to get to the spices and so forth. And I posed to my students, well, if you have this particular situation, remember you don't have a Suez Canal yet, how are you going to get there, you know? And basically the students realized, well, you can't do it by land. Nobody wants to walk across Russia, okay? You can't do it through the Arabian Peninsula because you don't control it. You have to do it by sea. And I talk about the Portuguese option, which is going around Africa, and the Spanish option, which is basically heading west a couple of thousand miles or so, and you'll make it to China. Well, you do if you use Columbus's calculations, which of course were wrong. You, unfortunately, from his point of view, run into some new continents. So I, again, look at that, look at the diffusion of Islam, because we bring that cultural element in. Talk about the Ottoman Empire, the extent of that, and also mention the fact that the Ottoman Empire had, and other earlier empires had actually occupied parts of Europe. So the European mindset is partly we've thrown these people back, we've pushed them back into Africa, we now need to basically surround them. We need to get out of this trap, basically, and find a way around, do a runaround, so to speak, of the Ottoman Empire at this particular point, 15th century. And I tell them it's not a coincidence that the last Muslim forces were thrown out in 1491 and Columbus does his thing in 1492. There's a reason why that particular date happened. So we do talk about these trips, and then we also look at the Columbian exchange here. And I talk about Native Americans, Europeans discovering basically this entirely new world. And then looking at some of the other maps, Middle America, coming first to the Caribbean, and then essentially getting to Mexico and then spreading out from there. And also talking about the fact that diseases spread so quickly, so by the time the conquistadors are actually attacking Mexico or attacking the Inca Empire in South America, the populations had already been devastated by diseases. So, this big question of, how did 200 Spaniards overcome 1 million Incas? No, that's not really what happened. Many of them had been dying off, and of course they're using native people who want this chance to overthrow their own oppressors in this particular area. So it's not as simple as the story usually is told. We talk about also the fact that very, very quickly after Columbus, literally 2 years later, the Spanish and the Portuguese get together with the Pope and divide the entire world between them, with Spain taking one side of the world and Portugal taking the other. And of course, the other European countries are paying absolutely no attention to all of this. And what else comes into play here? An English king who gets a little bit upset over the Catholic Church because it won't give him a divorce so he can marry Anne Boleyn. And that actually gets into the whole play. And then the English pay no attention whatsoever to any of this. Neither do the Dutch, neither do the French. And then everybody starts to come over to the Americas. So while the Spanish do have a large area that they are occupying and they are claiming, the Portuguese then also, of course, managed to claim Brazil and then parts of Africa as well. But then in later centuries, everybody's going to start taking parts of all kinds of continents. So we talk about the effect on Africans. In fact, you have the establishment of plantations and therefore the movement of Africans to the Americas in enormous numbers during the Atlantic slave trade. And then finally, we have the actual effect of the Columbian exchange. If we talk about the Columbian exchange, well, what was exchanged? Well, of course, you see from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas, you end up with quite a number of diseases that come over, quite a number of different domestic animals, livestock, and some grains, certainly some vegetables coming over, some grains coming over. But of course, there's quite a number of food items that go from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia, including, of course, the corn, the potato, the chocolate, the tomatoes, and so many other different crops that change the world, literally. So yes, there is an exchange in that sense. Whether it's an even exchange, I'm not so sure. But there definitely was an exchange. And once the Americas were discovered and food is coming out of there, silver is coming out of there, it starts affecting not only Europe, it starts affecting Asia. The Chinese are desirous of our silver to make their coins. And the Spanish get over to Asia, they get over to the Philippines and start trading with the Chinese. And now they're the ones that are directly buying goods from the Chinese. They're not dealing with intermediaries in the Silk Road. And they're bringing it across the Pacific, go across Mexico, and then back to Europe there. So all of these things have these enormous impacts throughout the entire world. And the book that we used, 1493, really does point this out, that very few people actually teach this as an integrated topic and integrated effect in the world. Everyone knows about Columbus, everyone knows about some of the other things, but that book really managed to put it together and say the consequences of that contact were really much greater than many people realize. So the students are given these different topics that they can write a paper on. They're, of course, just overexcited about writing papers, naturally, of course. They do go to the museums, and actually I got quite a number of fairly good papers from there, and quite a number of different topics, everything from the topics in the Native American Museum, the contact, to the Atlantic crossing on that. It keeps going on. We have effects on migration in modern times that come as a result of that, and then the effects on South America as well, and Southeast Asia finally. Agriculture in India is even affected. You have corn in India, potatoes in India. China is the world's biggest potato producer right now. I mean, so it is amazing how the American crops have spread throughout the world. And then, of course, European languages are spread throughout the world as well, European culture. So just as an example, you have all these European languages that are spoken in Africa, particularly English, French, Portuguese, still in the original two Portuguese colonies, and even a little bit of Spanish in some areas. Go ahead. So what we did is we visited the museums at a couple of times, and I've got some slides of the museums here. We have students here at the National Museum of the American Indian. There were a couple of different places, particularly there is one major exhibit there on modern life of Native Americans. There are pictures or portraits of Native Americans, and basically the question behind there is, what do Native Americans look like? And a lot of people just don't understand or don't know what they look like. And you've got pictures from people from all different types of tribes here. So students started getting, of course, very excited about this, and many of them started taking their own pictures of there. And then another area at the Museum of the American Indian is our universes, because the concept of the world and the universe that comes from Native American cultures is extremely different than those of other parts of the world. It's unique, just like other places are. And we started looking at those areas, and a number of students got pretty interested in that as well. So I just wanted to share a few pictures of different students here. And then the American History Museum, great exhibits of early ships, the use of hogsheads for shipping things, the way tobacco and sugar was shipped. You've got also, of course, pirates becoming very, very important here, either working independently or those working for certain European governments, because all of the wars in Europe were basically just continued in the Americas. So that became quite an exciting situation in the Americas here. And then, of course, quite a number of other exhibits that students were quite interested in. I think it was fairly successful. Quite a number of students finished what they were supposed to do, gave me some pretty good reports, and I got, I think they learned a great deal from it, and they really were quite interested in the museums. And I'm hoping to do it again this semester. This is assuming that it stops snowing at some particular time and we can actually get down there. So, and that's about it.